Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity.
In her speech about the single story, novelist Chimamanda Adichie describes the importance of storytelling. Stories of the past help influence the present and the future. It is for this purpose that we present to you the stories of 4 women and their experiences with regard to education and diversity. We will begin our story by taking you back to the 1950s.
Our 4 interviewees were all born in the early 1950s. This was the post-World War II era, marked as the golden period, emphasizing family values, stay-at-home mothers, and protected childhood. All the interviewees grew up in upper and middle-class homes and had strong family ties. Dr. Ortiz shared about her father's role in the family.
My father had like a 5th grade education. He was a smart man, but wasn't well educated, so he was like the driver for the wealthy people that lived in the town. So I think that kind of solidified my caste, my status in the community.
When the interviewees entered elementary school, they were surrounded by students of similar race and ethnicity. Little diversity existed within the school systems. 3 out of 4 of our interviewees shared about the students they went to school with.
We were mostly all Mexican Americans and a few white people. There was this other school with more white students, but my school was really in the hood. And yet most families were middle-class working Mexican American families.
As far as race, we were predominantly Italian or Jewish. And there really wasn't anything in between. There was maybe a few smatterings of other ethnics, but the majority was you were either of the Jewish faith or you were Italian. There was a few Irish people in there as well.
I was in a very, very white community. I think there were only 2 Hispanics in my elementary school at Pico Rivera.
During this time, segregation was still in existence. While a majority of students were of similar backgrounds, they experienced segregation in a different manner, by intellectual level. 2 of our interviewees shared how in elementary and junior high, they were put in classes based on their level of intelligence.
I remember that in 7th grade we were put into sections. And so 7-1 was the really smart kids, and 7-15 was the really dumb kids. And I was in 7-10, and I always knew that I shouldn't be in 7-10 because I just knew that I had greater capability than what I was being given credit for.
If I was in class 6-1, that means I was more intelligent than the ones that were in 6-5, 6 something or another, because it just, it was just that way, the way they numbered. It wasn't just because we had so many. They actually put you in the class that you intellectually.
The case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka of 1954 brought about a change within the country. In 1955, the Supreme Court issued its enforcement decree for the desegregation of schools. Although desegregation was mandated by federal law, changes were slowly taking effect. Frustration began to mount among the minorities, particularly blacks, which sparked the civil rights movement.
The 1960s was an era full of positive and negative emotions. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his famous I Have a Dream speech in 1963. This was a moment of hope for many people who disagreed with racism, discrimination, and civil injustices. That same year, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated during a presidential motorcade. Kathy recalls her experience when she found out that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
And they had the radio going on at the time, and my friend and I actually heard the news, the bulletin, that Kennedy had been assassinated. And we were like, it was an incredible thing to hear. And we went running to the principal's office, who had her secretary, and I said, "Did you hear what we heard on the radio?" They had the radio on. And we were like the first ones in the whole school to hear the news that Kennedy was assassinated.
It seemed that people reacted with confusion and anger for such brutality. But it was also a moment for many people, not only in the United States, but around the world, to join together in sorrow. On a brighter note, the famous band The Beatles became popular in the United States. Music from this decade mirrored the drastic changes of American society. It was now transitioning into a time when citizens began to question authority, and a new way of thinking had begun to develop.
The passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Kathy shared her experience.
And the people who were being bussed in were black. And there was a lot of prejudiceness going on. It's just, unfortunately, that's the way it was. And what happened was, and I believe this was my senior year, when the students were brought in, the black students felt that they were being treated unfairly, and they came up with a sort of a list of demands. And they wanted, I remember some of the demands were that they wanted more black history. They wanted more black teachers at the school. They wanted courses in black history. They wanted counseling to accommodate their needs.
In Los Angeles, there were riots and walkouts going on, demanding equal education opportunities. The walkouts were not only representing Latino rights, but they were also representing the rights for future generations, including of other ethnicities.
There were the riots for equal opportunity and equal education going on. All of these ideas were being implemented, and now I think it was really good because you were really able to dream. You had an option beyond high school. The whole U.S. had them. It was the riots and walkouts.
The civil rights movements and walkouts served as a base for a change of curriculum.
People from different cultures walked to the school district and demanded for Chicano studies like Chicano history and Chicano art. I remember that when I was in the 10th grade, there was no cultural connections to Hispanics, no ethnic studies, and no ethnic food. But by the time I was in my senior year, we had a few Chicano classes and the cafeteria burritos.
Right in the midst of 1960s, the U.S. troops were sent to Vietnam. The following year, there were mass drafts, and therefore the protests continued. Groups of activists were created, such as the Black Panthers and the Brown Berets.
I remember going on a walkout. It was a Cesar Chavez thing. At this time, you were proud of being Mexican American. We had the Brown Berets organizing our marches.
At the end of this decade, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. For many Americans, this was a pivotal moment in history. Awareness and activism would be dominant themes that began in the 1960s and transferred into the 1970s. The free love era that began in the 1960s with the civil rights movement continued well into the 1970s, where political awareness and activism grew due to conflicts in ideology over the Vietnam War. College-age students at this time began to find their voice and oftentimes found themselves in the middle of protests and political rallies.
There were full-blown walkouts. The riots continued. You would see a lot of promiscuity, people living together, without being married. There was the drugs rampage, the whole idea of free love.
One of the reasons the youth was upset was due in part to the young age of the servicemen and women at the time. The average age in the military was 21 years old, significantly lower than that of previous wars. Kent State Massacre, where 4 unarmed students were shot and killed by the Ohio National Guard, added to the anger and tension experienced by the youth at this time.
We had, I remember, the moratoriums, and when they gunned down the students at Kent State. Do you recall that issue? That was a whole big uproar. Even at FIT, where I went, they had like a moratorium, and they actually closed the school. In other words, I didn't even finish my semester at FIT because of the moratorium.
Spring noted that as demonstrations escalated, students began to question many institutions and values of American life. It was during the 70s that the 26th Amendment was ratified, allowing 18-year-olds to vote and adding even more fuel to the youth movement. Spring also recognized how Richard Nixon's election occurred on a promise to solve the problem of the Vietnam War and restore law and order to American campuses. In Boston, conflicts over the mandated busing program aimed at the racial integration of the school system led to protests and rallies. The landmark case, Roe v. Wade, also took place during the 1970s. This case overturned state laws banning abortion practices, and as you can imagine, following the era of free love, this was especially significant to this generation. Drug use was also very present.
Free love. When I first started college, I knew there were drugs, but I never saw it, never talked to anyone about it, until probably my senior year, as I was in a smaller house with 13 people, and I was aware that the people upstairs had it, and I was aware that a couple of the girls were using. But again, I never saw it, and it was never introduced to me. It was more about freedom. I was aware of abortions and things like that.
Although there were many historic movements happening, the 1970s are not completely negatively characterized. The music scene was completely changing. Elvis Presley passed away and music shifted to more adequately represent the attitude and feelings of the people it represents. Rock and roll became the voice of a generation, alongside disco and other feel-good music. Music and television became more inclusive, with shows such as Soul Train and American Bandstand sharing the spotlight. Other trends during this decade included having a rock as a pet, bell-bottom jeans, lava lamps, and Farrah Fawcett hairstyles.
As we know, history is cyclical. The stories of our 4 interviewees describe the educational system and social and political movements of the time. Our interviewees' stories could be used as a guide in creating purposeful experiences and educated decisions for our students. Instead of students alone demanding for change, we as educators need to be in the forefront, advocating with them.